Okay, hey there, GoPost students. Continuing my video series on YouTube. I'm done with content now. No more posting about judicial branch or the bureaucracy. From here on out, it's going to be all reviewing for the AP test. I am going to go and do unit reviews. So I'm going to review only the units that are on the AP test this year. Remember, that's been altered. Remember, political ideologies like liberal, conservative, libertarian, populist, all that's not on there. Political parties, interest groups are not going to be on there. The media is not going to be on there. So all that stuff isn't on there. So I will be doing unit reviews on Unit 1, Constitutional Underpinnings, Unit 2 for us, which is Civil Liberties and Civil Rights, and then Units 5 and 6, which is Congress, a President, and the Judicial Branch and the Bureaucracy. Please make sure you watch those videos on Judicial Branch and Bureaucracy. That's fair game. That could be one of the FRQs you get. So I am also going to do a court case review and a primary document review. So that'll be one video on itself. So I'm hoping to get Unit 1 and Unit 2 on one video, and then Unit 5 and Unit 6 on another video, and then the court cases and the primary documents on another. So that'd be 3 review videos. And then I'm also going to do 2 more on writing the FRQ, and that's what I'm going to do today right now. So today I'm going to focus on the concept application FRQ. So remember, if you watch the initial video I put about update on the GoPo test, there's only going to be 2 FRQs on the test and no multiple choice. And the 2 FRQs are going to be concept application and the argumentative essay, but they'll be in a altered state than how you were taught. Normally for concept application, you get 20 minutes, and normally for argumentative essay, you get 40 minutes. You're going to get 15 minutes for the concept application, and you're going to get 25 minutes for the argumentative essay for a total of 40 minutes, but you're going to have 45 minutes total with 5 minutes to upload your answer. So I'm covering the concept application today, and I'm going to do a review of an actual document of a concept application question. I'm actually going to do the review on the concept application of when I initially taught you of how to do. This is going to be a Unit 1 review concept application question, but there could be one on civil liberties, civil rights. There could be a concept application on the President and Congress. There could be a concept application on the bureaucracy and judicial branch. So you need to study all those topics. Even if we aren't having multiple choice, you need to know the verbs and the lingos and the language and the vocabulary terms that you can incorporate in your FRQs. Okay, so I can't stress that enough, ladies and gentlemen. Please go watch the bureaucracy and judicial branch lectures and Fed number 78 primary document. Okay, so I'm going to share this document with you here. This is the initial one. There we go. So this is the initial one that we learned how to write on. And it says up here, it suggested you take a few minutes to plan and outline each answer, and you should spend about approximately 20 minutes on each of the questions. That's false. You're going to spend 15 minutes on the concept application question, okay? So remember, the concept application question is where they're going to give you some sort of quote, maybe a quote from a primary document, maybe a quote from a famous political leader or a president, maybe a quote regarding a situation that's gone on, like this one right here. And then they're going to have you respond to that quote. Is a part of the history. Okay, so let's read this together. It says the Controlled Substance Act. Well, hold on. I'm getting in front of myself. Let's do this. The first thing we're going to do is break this down and figure out how many points this is worth. Okay, so before we start doing anything, we're going to underline all the verbs. Okay, remember, so underline or circle. Here we go. So circle the verbs. Here's describe. Okay, here's explain. Here's explain there, and how the congressional power described in Part A. Okay, so how many points is this worth, ladies and gentlemen? Okay, how many points is this one worth? And it's worth 3 points. Now, remember, some of these might be worth multiple points within, all right? But this one itself here is worth 3 points. 1 point for Part A, 1 point for Part B, and 1 point for Part C. And then I also want you to underline what the verb is asking you to do. So we circled describe, and it says describe, underline, a power that Congress could use to address the issue. So they want you to describe a power Congress could have to fix the issue up here. Okay, so you're basically going to reword that in your own head. This is asking you to and we'll get back to the best friend analogy here in a little bit. Describe what Congress could do about this. That's what it's asking you to do. So in the context of the scenario, and again, explain, okay, and we'll get to explain in a little bit. So that's the verb, how the use of the congressional power could impact the states. So we need to reword that in our own head. Now, you're not going to have time to write it out because you only have 15 minutes like I taught you to do. So in your own head, reword this question. So explain how what Congress did here is going to have an effect on the states. So how is what you said in part A, how is that going to impact the states, right? And then C, in the context of scenario, explain, there's our verb again. So we circle this, how this interaction between the US, Congress, and the states is a part of the history of federalism in the United States. So they're asking you to explain how this from part A and B in the scenario shows federalism, shows how the history of federalism in the United States. So how does what this scenario creates and what you describe, the interaction between Congress and the states, how does that show the history of federalism? That's what that. So remember, before you start the question, go through, circle the verbs, underline what the verb is asking you to do, and just in your head, translate what the question is asking you to do. Normally, I want you to write that question out, but I don't think you're going to have time to do that. So we need to break this down to make it easier, just real quick. Describe a power that Congress has that can fix this issue. How would that power, you described in A, impact the states? And how does what you described between A and B, how does that show the history of federalism in the United States? So you're just going to translate this in your own words so you understand it. Okay? Now, I did that in words that I understand it. You need to do that for yourself before you start. Okay? So let's go through and let's read the question and then let's answer the question. Okay? Step by step. Remember, we're going to do systematic writing. Okay? And we're going to assume that the reader has no idea about government and politics. Okay? We're going to assume that the reader is a complete idiot when it comes to reading government and politics, political issues. And so we are going to go above and beyond what we think we need to do to describe, explain, identify, or draw a conclusion about. Okay? We don't want to assume that the reader knows any reference we're making it to. Remember, you're not writing this FRQ to Mr. Shefferly. You're writing it to a stranger. So don't write it like you're writing to me. Write it to someone who you think, write it to your 5-year-old little brother or sister or cousin. And you have to explain in detail every little part of it like you're talking to a little child that knows nothing about this. So go above and beyond the number of examples you think you need. Okay? Leave no doubt to when you get done writing your FRQ, the reader has no choice but to give you every point. And keep in mind, this is only a 3-point FRQ, but it's worth the same amount of points as the argumentative essay FRQ, which is going to have 7 points on it. So this FRQ is worth half of the test, but yet there's only 3 points available. The argumentative essay FRQ is going to have 7 points available, but it's still worth half of your total grade. That means that each grade that you score, each point that you score here, ladies and gentlemen, is worth roughly 16.33%, right? So each point here is worth 16.33% of your overall grade. Miss 1 point here, you're already down at an 80% on the test. Okay? Miss 2 points here, you're already now below a 70% on the test. Okay, so each one of these points is extremely important. Not to say that on the argumentative essay they're not, but the argumentative essay is worth 25% of the test. Well, there's 7 points available on the argumentative essay, right? So each point there is going to be worth roughly 3.4%. So if you miss 1 point on the argumentative essay, your grade only drops by 3.4%. You miss 1 point here, and your grade drops over 16%. Okay, so it's like 16. That's like 16.5%, around there, 16.66666%, I think is what it rounds out to. So almost 17% per each one. Okay, so make sure we're nailing each one of these points. All right, now let's go over the verbs, ladies and gentlemen. Remember the verbs that you're probably going to see: identify, define, describe, explain, draw a conclusion. Those are the verbs that we discussed: identify, define, describe, explain, and draw a conclusion. So remember the best friend analogy. If the question is asking you to identify something, maybe it just says identify a power of Congress. Well, remember, just identify your best friend, but write it out in a complete sentence. Okay. My best friend is Jim. Okay. But we're going to write this out. The identification of my best friend is a man named Jim. Now, my best friend's name isn't Jim, but I'm just making that up. Okay. So write it out in a complete sentence. But if it asks you to identify, you're just identifying your best friend. You're not saying anything else about your best friend. Now, if you happen to use a vocabulary word in your identification, I do want you to define that vocabulary word. Okay. So for example, here, if we were looking at this, we could say that Congress could amend the Constitution. Well, what's an amendment? Right? So if you were to say Congress can amend the Constitution, if this asks you to identify a power Congress had, you could say, well, Congress could pass a formal amendment. I would want you to identify, I would want you to define what a formal amendment is. Correct? So if it just asks you to identify a power of Congress, now we're going to go over describe, but if all it did was ask you to identify a power that Congress has, you could say Congress could pass a formal amendment. I would want you to define what a formal amendment is. A formal amendment is an official change to the wording in the actual Constitution. It is different than a law because it requires large supermajorities of 2/3 vote of Congress and 3/4 of state legislatures and cannot be overturned by a simple law or by the judicial branch. So you would have to then clearly define what a formal amendment is if you use that in your identification, because we're assuming the reader knows nothing about that. Okay. Now, the describe our best friend. Now, I'm not just saying who my best friend is. I'm not just saying Jim is my best friend. It's asking us to go above and beyond and give examples, give an account of who your best friend is. You have to give examples, maybe definitions. Okay. So for example, I would say Jim is 6'2". Jim has blonde hair. Jim likes to eat Italian food as his favorite thing. Jim's favorite sport to play is golf. Jim loves to read nonfiction. Jim has a good sense of humor. I'm giving lots of examples to describe who my best friend is. So remember, when you see the word describe here, they're asking for examples, and you have to assume that the reader doesn't know what those examples are. So go into detail of those examples. If you use a vocabulary term in your description, try to define what that vocabulary word is. Okay. Now, the last verb we're going to look at here is explain. Now, remember, explain is how or why. Remember the best friend analogy. How or why are you best friends? Now, I'm not going to go and talk about what Jim is like. I'm not going to go and describe Jim's personality or Jim's looks. I'm going to go and explain how or why Jim and I became best friends. And I'm going to give examples to show that. So Jim and I are best friends because we've known each other since we were 5. Jim and I are best friends because we've been through traumatic events together. Jim and I are best friends because we both have the same likes. And I'm going to give examples to show how or why we are best friends. So when it says to explain how the use of congressional power is in Part A, so we're now going to talk about how or why the power we described here is going to actually impact the states. Okay? All right, so let's go through and read the quote, and then I'm going to walk through what I think a good answer to this would be. And remember, there's multiple correct answers in here. Okay? Multiple correct answers. So try to think of these as we go along. So let's read this. The Controlled Substance Act, passed by Congress, by the U.S. Congress in 1970, designates marijuana as a Schedule I drug, making it illegal to possess and distribute. 64% of Americans believe marijuana should be legal, and in the past decade, a number of states have legalized the possession of marijuana. Colorado sold more than $1 billion in recreational marijuana last year, but deep-pocketed investors were excited to take on something bigger, California. The Adult Use of Marijuana Act legalized marijuana in 2016, but many California investors are concerned by the fact that although marijuana may be legal in their state, its possession is still a federal crime. So here we have a quote from a news source called NPR. We now have to do this, and we have to answer the question responding to this quote. So this quote might be a quote from a news source. It might be a quote from a primary document like the Constitution or Declaration of Independence, or maybe Federalist Papers, right? Or Brutus. It might be a quote from a politician. So who knows? So let's go with this. What now? We just need to summarize in our head, what is this asking us of? Many states are allowing marijuana to be a legally possessed drug, right? And many states are passing legalization marijuana laws, but investors are concerned about investing in marijuana because marijuana is still a federal crime. So we're translating this issue. And so we're looking at the Controlled Substance Act has an issue where we have federal law and state law are conflicting with each other. So that's what this quote's about. And that's what I want you to do as you read the quote, is to just translate the quote. And so you break it down and understand what the quote is saying. Okay? Now, here we go. So it says, describe a power that Congress could use to address the issue outlined in the scenario. Well, before we describe a power, let's list a bunch of powers that Congress has that could be used in this scenario to address it. So before we describe it, let's identify a bunch of them, and then we'll pick one that we think is the easiest for us to answer. So in your head, just think about this. Go ahead. Just list in your head, or write them down if you want to. What are some ways that what are some powers that Congress could have to address this issue? Okay. Well, I'm thinking of some off the top of my head. Congress could pass another law. Congress could amend the Controlled Substance Act. Congress could pass a formal amendment that would change the Controlled Substance Act. Congress could adjust funding for the Drug Enforcement Agency and remove their ability to enforce the Controlled Substance Act. So that I've just identified a bunch of different things. What I would want you to do is in your head, just identify a bunch of answers that would be a power Congress could have, and then pick the one that you think is easiest for you to answer that you know the most about. Okay. So for example, if we were going to say, describe a power that Congress, so they're asking about the power Congress could do. Okay. They don't want you to describe how that would resolve the issue. They want you to describe the power, right? So let's go ahead and talk about Congress defunding an agency. Congress has power of the purse. So we've identified the power now. What does that mean? Power of the purse means Congress gets to appropriate all money that the executive branch gets to spend. So every single government agency that enforces government laws has to first get their money appropriated from a congressional agency. That's what we mean by power of the purse. So if Congress wanted to address this issue above, Congress could change the funding that is given to the government agency that enforces the Controlled Substance Act. In this case, it would be the Drug Enforcement Agency. Now, whether you knew that or not, you wouldn't have to name the DEA, but it would be impressive if you could, okay? And so if you could just say, Congress could alter the funding that the agency would get, okay? Everybody with me on that? Now, that's giving a description of the power Congress has. Let's give an example of how changing funding would address the issue. Okay. If Congress decided to defund the agency that enforces the Controlled Substance Act, that in turn would make it impossible for the federal government to stop the states from practicing those laws. Okay. So now we're going to come down here and explain how the use of that congressional power in A is, right? Okay. So now we're going to go more into details. So these sort of blend together a little bit here. Explain means how or why. Okay. So how the use of defunding would impact the states. Well, if Congress decided to defund the government agency that enforces the Controlled Substance Act, then the federal government would not be able to enforce the Controlled Substance Act that conflicts with the state laws. Now, we're still going to go even further and give more examples. The states then would be able to pass more marijuana legalization laws and not have to worry about their state businesses being impacted by the Drug Enforcement Agency, because the Drug Enforcement Agency would have no ability to enforce the Controlled Substance Act onto the states. Therefore, investors would have less concern about investing into marijuana in the states, and the states would have the freedom to either pass more marijuana legalization laws or less marijuana legalization laws, because they wouldn't have to worry about the federal agency, in this case, the DEA, enforcing the Controlled Substance Act. Okay, so I gave multiple examples there of how Congress defunding the government agency that enforces the Controlled Substance Act is going to have an impact on the states. Okay, now we could do the same thing with passing a formal amendment. We would then have to describe what a formal amendment is, how a formal amendment gets passed, how that's different than a regular law, and then how a formal amendment would have that impact on the states. So, but here, I think it's key that you just in your head list out multiple, identify multiple correct answers, and then pick the one that you're most confident in answering. Okay, so there's more than one correct answer for part A, there's more than one correct answer for part B, and there's also more than one correct answer for part C. What you need to do is in your head, try to brainstorm very quickly and think about what some of the possible correct answers are, and then answer using the one that you're most confident in answering. Okay? All right, let me get a drink of water here. Okay, so let's go on to the last one where it says, in the context of the scenario, explain how this interaction between U.S. Congress and the states is a part of the history of federalism in the United States. So, for those of you that have been paying attention all year long, you know that the first thing that you should do in this part of the answer is what? What would it be? And that's correct. You should define what federalism is, because we have to assume that the reader doesn't know what the definition of federalism is. So the very first thing you should do is federalism, which is the shared power between the federal government and state government, or the distribution of power between the federal government and state government, is shown here because of blank, blank, blank. But you're going to give the definition of federalism. Anytime you actually use a vocabulary term in your FRQs, I want you to define it and assume the reader doesn't know what that word means. Okay? So anytime it comes up, if you get an FRQ about due process, you better define what due process is. If you get an FRQ about executive orders, you better, and you use the term executive order, you better define what executive order is. If you get a bureaucratic FRQ and it talks about discretionary authority, you better define what that is. Okay? Or even if it's not in the question, but you use it in your answer, you better define what that term is, because we're making sure the reader knows that we know what we're talking about. Okay? So let's go ahead and do this one here. Okay? Well, how is this scenario here showing the history of federalism in the United States? Well, we've already defined what federalism is. Okay? It is the shared or distribution of power between the federal governments and the state governments. Okay? So we're going to explain how or why this is. So we're going to explain that this is showing the history of where power has shifted sometimes to the state governments and sometimes to the federal governments. Over time, we've had the federal government get bigger and smaller and in power, and we've had, over time, state governments grow or shrink in power. Everything has to come back to power that the state and federal governments have. Okay? Now, how does this show the history of that? Well, think about, let's just list in our head some ways of which federalism has been shown to have a struggle between the state and federal governments. Okay, that's what we have here, a struggle between state and federal governments, right? Think about in your head about what we studied, just list some ideas of how we've studied where federal and state governments conflicted with each other. Okay, or philosophies about federal and state governments conflicted with each other. So right away in your head, you should be thinking anti-federalists and federalists, right? Federalists wanted more state power to the national government when we passed the Constitution. Anti-federalists wanted more state power when we passed the Constitution, right? So then we can't just say anti-federalists and federalists. We have to clearly define what an anti-federalist and what a federalist is, right? And certainly you could use the Federalist Papers in Brutus No. 1. The Federalist Papers were written by the Federalists to convince the public that the federal government should have more power than the state governments, because remember, we tried those things called the Articles of Confederation and they didn't work, whereas Brutus No. 1 was trying to convince the voters to not ratify the new Constitution because he was concerned that the federal government would grow too big and end up dwarfing the state governments. Now there's some key vocabulary terms in here that I think we should be using, right? So think in your head, what are some key vocabulary terms that we could be using to show the history of federalism in the United States? Okay, specifically, you should be talking about the Commerce Clause, right? And then we would have to define what the Commerce Clause is. It's the ability of the federal government to regulate any economic activity between the states, right? The Supremacy Clause should be coming to mind. The Supremacy Clause says that if a state law and a federal law ever conflict with each other, then the Constitution reigns supreme, correct? Okay. You should also be thinking about a court case that really deals with state versus federal, about federalism, where does the state government have the power to do it? Does the federal government have the power to do it? It's one of the very first court cases we studied. I'll pause for dramatic effect there, ladies and gentlemen, because I don't like this format, but this is what I would do in the classroom. Okay, remember McCulloch versus Maryland. Okay, McCulloch versus Maryland, where the federal government tried to establish a national bank, and some of the state governments, like Maryland, tried to tax the national bank. And that came out that even though that a national bank was not put into the Constitution as something the federal government could do, it was implied that the federal government had the authority to establish a national bank. And remember, the McCulloch versus Maryland case brought about what phrase or clause in the Constitution? That's right, the Necessary and Proper Clause. Because remember, the Necessary and Proper Clause says that the federal government does have implied powers. And how does that impact the history of federalism? Because of McCulloch versus Maryland, it showed that the federal government had implied powers, which allowed the federal government to expand its power beyond what was just enumerated in the Constitution, right? And that's why we call the elastic, I just gave the answer right there. That's why we call the Necessary and Proper Clause also called the Elastic Clause, okay? But then we would have to go on to show, okay, examples or definitions of that. And we would be showing that this case is showing the history of conflict between people that wanted more state power or more federal power. You could even go on and bring into grants if you wanted to, categorical grants and block grants, whereas Federalists would be in favor of categorical grants, and then we would have to define what categorical grants are. Categorical grants are money given from the federal government to the state government for a very specific narrow purpose, and they expand the power of the federal government over state governments. Versus block grants are still money given from the federal government to the state government, but anti-federalists would be in favor of block grants because that gives the states more discretion on what to do with the money that the federal government gives them, therefore increasing state power. Okay, so I gave you a bunch of answers there, but I went above and beyond what was needed. And of course, we would have to more clearly define what McCulloch versus Maryland is. We would have to more clearly define what the Necessary and Proper Clause is. We would have to very clearly define what the Commerce Clause is. You could even give an example of, say, U.S. versus Lopez, right? That would be another example of the confliction between federal government and state government. Remember U.S. versus Lopez and the Guns Free School Zone Act? I'm sure all of you remember that, right? Yes, Jeffrey, of course. All right. Can you tell I'm getting bored doing this? Okay. So those would be all examples of where we're going way above and beyond what we need. We're leaving no doubt that we know what federalism is, and we have studied the history of federalism, and we're relating that to how now this is just the latest in events of where the federal government and the state government are having a battle over who has power, right? Okay, so this is how writing a concept application would go, ladies and gentlemen. I have put tons of examples of concept application questions on both Google Classroom and both Schoology as well. There are concept application questions on Schoology under each unit, Unit 1, Unit 2, Unit 5, and Unit 6. And I've also posted a bunch of concept application questions if Schoology is kind of sketchy a little bit, that are on there. Let me get this screen share off. Okay, so again, email me if you have questions or clarification. I'm sorry that this is the format that you have to take the test under, but I'm trying to do the best I can to help everybody along. And I want you to do well on the test, because at least you can say, we got this, Sheriff Lee. We at least got to pass the AP government test. You guys are in a bad situation. I feel terrible for you. I just do. I feel terrible for me too. It's selfish. I want to be in the gym with you guys, and I want to walk down into the bowl and see all your faces. I love doing that. I'm going to miss, we don't even get to do GoPo songs. Tristan said the other day, Dad, we don't get to do GoPo songs. So, But I am going to try and do personal finance through YouTube. So I'm going to, hopefully I can post some personal finance lectures and post some stuff on Google Classroom, some calculators like investment calculators and buying a car calculator that you'll be able to use as well. Okay, my next video series is going to be argumentative essay. And that is a different format than what I originally taught you. They changed that up a little bit. So in addition to changing the format of the test, they changed the format of one of the questions, the argumentative essay question. So just a little bit, not that much, not that much. So, but I will go over that on my next series. Okay. All right, everybody, take care and email me if you got any questions, and I'll try to get a hold of you as soon as I can.